I'd only met him a few times at that point in time. I hosted him for a full day at Fort Campbell, Kentucky when I was a two-star after I came home from the first year in Iraq as the commander of the 101st Airborne Division for the fight to Baghdad, and then the subsequent beginning of the counterinsurgency campaign in Mosul. And indeed, I'd like to think our division had some unique approaches, and they didn't all survive, frankly, unfortunately. The Reconciliation Initiative in particular was not supported in Baghdad, and it was reversed after we left. We had some pretty good period there, and it was seen as an area that I guess was what right looks like, if you will. And he came out to see us, and that was a wonderful day, actually. I was really impressed by the president and the amount of time that he spent. We had, I think, we'd probably lost 60 soldiers at that point at Fort Campbell, not just in the 101st, but some also in the 160th Special Ops Aviation 5th Special Forces Group. And the family members of each of those soldiers were positioned all the way around in the museum at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. And he spent a full 5 minutes, I think, with every single one of them. It was so far off schedule, it wasn't funny. And then I was sent back, of course, fairly soon, actually, after getting home to establish the so-called train and equip mission, the mission to try to develop, really recruit, train, equip, and develop all the forces of the Ministry of Interior and the Ministry of Defense, including the ministries themselves, ultimately, not to mention building all the infrastructure that they need and all the doctrine, every piece of a modern military and again, police force in all respects. And it was a gargantuan task, and that was a 15-and-a-half-month tour. I'd actually been sent back to do an assessment of the Iraqi security forces shortly after I got home as a two-star. I came back and reported that out to Secretary Rumsfeld, and then essentially his, reward for that was, okay, go over there and implement what it is you say you need to do. And so we did, and we made a great deal of progress, although this was, an effort that was truly Sisyphean in some respects, and it really was pushing a stone up the hill. But he did know that we'd written the counterinsurgency field manual while I was at Leavenworth after coming back. He called me in after I came back as a three-star. I remember I gave him some fairly frank assessments, and I'd written something up. I hadn't cleared it with the secretary or the chairman, and I'm just a three-star at this point. And you got all the national security team there in the Oval Office, but he starts asking, so what are your takeaways? What are your conclusions? What about this guy? What about that guy? And it was a wonderful conversation, and perhaps he remembered that later on. I think he actually took me out and did a rose garden saying thank, or maybe in the Oval Office as well. But the truth is that what happened, I think, is as the situation in Iraq spiraled downward so seriously in 2006 in particular, after the bombing of this very sacred Shia shrine north of Baghdad, and it just unleashed sectarian violence between Shia and Sunni, and it played, and Al-Qaeda wanted that to happen. They wanted to be a catalyst for a civil war, frankly, to tear the country apart. And it was very, very serious. And he had different individuals in to advise him, and they did not always agree on the way forward, frankly. Some said there should be a surge, others said you should hand it off quicker and get out, others said put more special forces in and that'll solve it. But apparently they typically agreed that what he also should do is actually send me back over there. And so that's what happened, obviously. And I remember going to see him after we had the confirmation hearing, and I think I gave him a signed copy of the counterinsurgency field manual. I said, well, this is what we're going to implement. And he said, yep. And he said, I guess we're doubling down, General. And I said, Mr. President, we're not doubling down in the military. We're going all in, and we need all the rest of government to go all in as well. And he really pushed that. He had such unbelievable focus on the effort in Iraq. the week in Washington every Monday morning began at 7:30 with the entire national security team around the Situation Room table, the president at the head, and Ambassador Ryan Crocker and me on a video teleconference for an entire hour. It started promptly on time, ended on time, and it was all dialogue between him and us, and occasionally someone else could chime in. It was not asking the people around the table how they thought it was going. It was going directly to the two of us that were most charged. Now they had the Central Command commander would be on video teleconference, and of course the chairman and the secretary and Secretary of State and others were all there. But again, it was dialogue between the three of us generally. And it was quite an extraordinary degree of focus. In fact, then the Secretary of Defense would have one with me the next day. And then most weeks, Prime Minister Maliki had one with the President that Ambassador Crocker and I would also attend. So there was a huge amount of focus from the White House, from the President. And that obviously galvanized all of the executive branch to try to do as much as they could to retrieve what was a very, very desperate situation. Maybe here I should talk about strategic leadership because, I'd done arguably strategic leadership before, but this is really strategic leadership. And a definition of strategic leadership would be that you are leading a very large organization and you are the one charting the course for it. You have quite a degree of latitude. So this is a CEO kind of position. And, we ultimately had 165,000 Americans just on the ground there, almost that number of contractors as well, and then many, many more that were on aircraft carrier in bases in the Gulf states, whatever, supporting us as well. So it was an enormous effort. But a strategic leader has four tasks, in my view. The first is to get the big ideas right. And as I mentioned earlier, those don't come easy. It has to be the result of a lot of thinking, inclusive discussions, seminars, conferences, whatever it may be. But you've got to get them right. And if you don't get them right, if you don't get the strategy right, all else is for naught. Everything else you're building then is on a foundation of sand. The second task is to communicate those big ideas effectively throughout the breadth and depth of the organization. And you do this in every way possible. The third task is to oversee the implementation of them, because of course you're not the one implementing them directly. That's many levels below you, but you certainly have to go out and see for it yourself. You have to have metrics, you have to have a battle rhythm, you have to have a whole series of tasks that you perform yourself, campaign plan reviews and on and on. It's quite exhaustive. And then the fourth task is you have to identify how those big ideas need to be refined. It's the process of identifying lessons, if you will, but lessons aren't learned until they're actually incorporated in the documents, the campaign plan, the policies, the procedures, the SOPs, whatever, that are the mechanism for conveying the big ideas. In Iraq, the big ideas were, in most cases, a complete shift from what it was that we were doing before. The biggest of the big ideas was that the human terrain is a decisive terrain, i.e. the people are the prize. You have to secure the people. And you can only secure the people by living with them, by locating your bases where they live, in their neighborhood. And so at a time when we were retreating to big bases, concentrating all our forces on big bases and going out driving around a few times a day, and then be back at the big base to hand off quicker to the Iraqis, we reversed that. And we ultimately established, for example, we had to fight for and establish 77 additional locations at which our troopers were located, together with Iraqis typically, 77 just in the greater Baghdad divisional area. Another idea that, hand off to the Iraqis. I stopped the transition to the Iraqis. They could not handle the level of violence. In fact, their units had deteriorated. Not only had they not gotten better, albeit less so than the level of violence, they'd actually gone downhill as violence had gone up. And so we stopped transitioning them. In some cases, we reversed it. We took units offline. We had the government replace commanders wholesale in many cases. and had to take every one of the brigades of the police divisions, the 2 police divisions, offline one after the other, and go through a 30-day retraining program and go back into the fight. So the third big idea was that you can't kill or capture your way out of an industrial strength insurgency, and that's what we faced. Ultimately, we reconciled with some 85,000 Sunni insurgents alone, just to give you a sense of the scale, and some 25,000 Shia militia extremists as well. This is industrial strength. So you can't kill. We'd been killing or capturing every night. Joint Special Operations Command, Admiral McRaven's force. Subsequently, it was General McChrystal at the time. They were doing 10, 15 operations a night, and they had been. And the situation in some of the areas was getting worse, not better. So it's not enough to go out and do kinetic operations. What you have to do is persuade as many as possible of those who are part of the problem to become part of the solution, to give them an incentive to support the new Iraq rather than to continue to oppose it. And we did. And that was reconciliation. Ultimately, it was the awakening. Sunni Arabs decided that they would throw off al-Qaeda if we could secure them, to be sure. Then they joined in and helped the security. Then we got them incorporated as Sons of Iraq and all the rest. But this was, again, a huge change. There was a tiny bit of reconciliation that was going on, but it wasn't developing at all the way it was. I made my first trip to see that, in fact, within 3 days of taking command. And I said, this is what we're going to do, and let's get on with it. Then, though, you have irreconcilables. You can identify them now even more than before. And so General McChrystal's Joint Special Operations Command, our counterterrorist forces, later Admiral McRaven's, they amped up their operations even more. Then we had detainees. We had, when I took command, something probably 18,000, 19,000 detainees, and we were releasing them because of pressure from the Iraqi government. And I said, stop. We are not going to release any more detainees until we have a program for rehabilitating them, for preparing them to go back into society. But we can't even do that until we identify who the hardcore detainees are, who are corrupting all the others and who have turned our detention facilities into a terrorist training university. So we stopped that. Huge pressure from the Iraqi government, who wanted their sons back regardless of what they'd done. They're the tribes, at least. And it ultimately was 27,000 before we started actually the process. But we had a review process, rehabilitation, job training, basic skills, and a variety of other tasks. But we had to go into these enclosures and find the most extreme, pull them out. And by the way, you do that unarmed because you never take a weapon into a detention facility. These are open. There's 700, 800 detainees in one of these enclosures, all very humane, very good food, health care, and everything else. But very, very challenging mission for our military police. So again, that gives you a sense of how we just completely reversed the big ideas that were the strategy. And I changed the mission statement and the first piece of our campaign plan within that first week. I knew what I needed to do. I didn't need to go through a process of, I'd been in Iraq for 2.5 years at that point in time, and then studied it when I was not there and worked out these ideas for counterinsurgency. Now, and I started communicating them, the second task, the very first day, right after taking the colors, if you will, and becoming the commander in your change of command remarks. And that's where the focus is on securing the people. It can only be done by living with them, not by consolidating on a big basis. And then I gathered the commanders together who were at the change of command, of course, and talked to them about what we were going to do. Put out a letter to all of our troopers on the very first day, the soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, Coast Guardsmen, and civilians of Multinational Force Iraq. And then it went on and on from there. Then ultimately we revised the whole campaign plan, et cetera, et cetera. Then the overseeing the implementation, we had to work metrics very hard. It took 6 months before I was willing to actually release how we reached the metrics, how we arrived at them, what were the definitions for the terms and all the rest of that, to sit down with the New York Times, the Washington Post, the major networks, and go through them. So you can tell, are we winning or are we losing? Are we making progress is a better way actually of saying, or are we not? because I don't think you win these kinds of endeavors. There's no taking the hill, planting the flag, and going home to a victory parade. Rather, you drive the level of violence down, but you have to maintain focus. And in fact, tragically, we saw what happened when that focus was not maintained over the past 2.5 or so years, and where, unfortunately, Prime Minister Maliki undid a lot of what we'd done together to bring the fabric of society back together, Sunni back with Shia, by going after Sunni political figures, by putting down peaceful demonstrations very violently, and essentially giving the Sunni Arabs once again a stake in the failure of the new Iraq rather than a stake in its success. So, and then we had a formal lessons learned process. We had the Center for Army Lessons Learned teams with our units. We had the asymmetric warfare group, very former special operators and serving special operators out with units. We had the joint lessons learned team. And every time I sat down with our commanders, whenever we had a commanders conference as part of overseeing the implementation or a campaign plan review quarterly with the ambassador as well, would go through, everybody had to identify one or two lessons or best practices that were applicable to all. And then we'd work on actually tracking, because again, the lesson isn't learned when it's identified. I actually used to joke and say the Center for Army Lessons Learned should be renamed. It should be the Center for Army Lessons Identified, because it's not learned until they're put into the doctrinal manuals, the instruction to our leaders, the collective training exercises or combat, whatever it may be. My dad was a Dutch merchant mariner who came to the United States when the Nazis overran Holland, and his ship was at sea. They couldn't obviously go back to Rotterdam, from which they'd sailed, and so they went into New York Harbor eventually. And virtually all of the crew signed on with the U.S. Merchant Marine, and that meant that they had a very long war. It was the highest, the service that had the highest per capita casualties in all of our military services. It was treated as part of the military at the time. The casualties were so high, in fact, that although the United States could replace the ships, they were producing Liberty ships left and right, they actually couldn't produce the crews, and so very young officers ended up with very high responsibility. My father was actually the captain of a Liberty ship at the age of 29. They did a Murmansk run. They to northern Russia. They lost a huge number of ships in the convoy. So it was a very hazardous war for him. He ultimately he met my mother in Brooklyn during that time, and they ultimately settled in the Hudson River Valley, about 50 miles north of New York City, in a little village called Cornwall-on-Hudson. It's a quintessential small-town America, 7 miles around Storm King Mountain from the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. And my dad ultimately left the sea because at that time they were expected to sail for 11 months straight and then get 1 month off. And like any good ship captain, he knew how to generate power. That's what's done, obviously, to power a ship. And so a number of them all went into the booming industry of new electrical generation stations that were being created all over America as part of the post-war boom. And he was an operating room engineer, supervisory engineer at one of those about 10 miles from our house. My dad was really a crusty old Dutch sea captain at heart, even though by the time I was arrived in the world, if you will, he had already taken up his new career. His attitude was one of results boy, and he was not a guy who looked kindly on excuses. I mean, he wasn't. He was a very loving father, and occasionally a bit of gruff love, but again, very devoted, as my mother was, to both of their children. Extraordinarily so, in truth. I mean, there was nothing they would not do for either of us. But we grew up, we had a sailboat the whole time that I was growing up. We actually had two for a while. I had a sailboat, about a 20-footer. It was not a trivial little sunfish. It was a real sailing boat. And it was a great experience to do that. And he was very supportive of, obviously, the academic endeavors, but also of various athletic endeavors. He taught me how to ski. He took me to games. We did all kinds of different activities. In fact, even around the house we had, I mean, this is an incredible, it was a very small little, again, small town America house built right after World War II. But we had a high bar for doing pull-ups. We had a rope under a tree that you could climb. We had a pitcher's mound and a backstop for baseball. We had a little croquet golf course with coffee cans in it. We had a croquet set. We had lawn darts. We had, we had a basketball backboard and net. And even in the basement, we had, using little 2x4s, we could play floor hockey because I also skated and played hockey over the years. But eventually I settled in on soccer and on skiing, downhill skiing, and I played both of those all the way through college. We're just a sort of typical middle-class family. I mean, we weren't rolling in money. My mother was really focused at home. She did work at the local library part-time, but again, it was a household of modest means, but one that focused a great deal on school, on academics, and they both were very significant intellectuals. They both loved to read. In fact, the house was overflowing with books, and my mother, I think, had at one point in time 3 or 4 full sets of Dickens, for example, from secondhand bookstores. I mean, the joy in life for them was to go, and they had a big camper, and they'd go around the country, and if you found a secondhand bookstore on the way, that was a special day. When I was growing up, we would usually have 2, I think it was 1 week or maybe even 2-week vacations a summer, and one of those would almost always would end up at Boston, and we would recreate, the route that Paul Revere followed and visit the North Church, and would go to Lexington Green, and would go to Concord and the Rood Bridge that arched the flood, and we'd read all the stirring novels, Here the Embattled Farmer Stood and Fired the Shot Heard Around the World, and all of that. I might add, if you fast forward some 50 some odd years, I commissioned our son as a second lieutenant in the infantry in the U.S. Army at the Minuteman statue in Concord, right by the bridge. And it was really a special moment. In fact, it was interesting because I was back for what might have been the most emotionally charged hearings, I think, that any military commander and diplomat, Ambassador Ryan Crocker, had in recent memory. These were the hearings of September 2007 on the surge, and our first opportunity, frankly, to report that we were actually making progress in the surge, although it had not been apparent, frankly, back in Washington at that point in time. And there was a significant group on the Hill that I think really would have, in fact, a vote to cut off funding for Iraq was only narrowly defeated by 2 votes. So that was an interesting moment. We came back, I guess, on a Thursday. We did some murder boards and so forth, and then we went down to Fort Benning, Georgia, for our son's final jump. We were on the drop zone, and so and then we actually went to a Ranger graduation. I spoke at that, and then they had the ceremony to pin on jump wings, and I got to pin my father-in-law's jump wings on him, which was a special moment. Command and combat is a fairly grinding endeavor, frankly. I occasionally would play with folks a little bit, and they'd say, gee, what is it like to be the commander of the surge, to command all these forces in Iraq and so forth, and these big missions? And, I'd say it's the most unbelievably awesome experience that you can possibly imagine on a good day. But there aren't many good days. We had a lot of history books around. We had the Landmark series, as you're growing up, and an awful lot of those were very attractive. And reading about, the old frontiersmen, the West Pointers, and so forth. And really growing up in a town, gosh, half the people in the newspaper route that I had, and in those days, kids still delivered newspapers, and I don't know, I had 40 or 50 customers or something, and half of them were either West Point graduates or employed at West Point. So it had a huge influence in our community. My math teacher in high school, one of them was a former professor of math at West Point. Our high school soccer coach had actually coached the West Point team when it won the national championship some couple of decades earlier when he was a younger officer. And he coached our team for $1 a year, and we did win the championship actually in my senior year, which is sort of, that's one of those glory days moments that Bruce Springsteen sings about. It's pretty extraordinary, really. The whole town follows you to the game, follows the bus back, and it was a real thrill. I guess it was a few years into high school or so, looking at the different options. And to be candid, my mom was not all that enamored of the idea. She'd gone to Oberlin. She was a very liberal arts kind of person. Saw this as a bit of a rough and tumble affair and wanted, her son to have a slightly perhaps more academic approach, whatever it may be, noting that West Point is typically, assessed to be one of the top 10 or 20 schools in America. And so they were very proud, obviously, when I got an appointment to West Point and went there, and they were there for the first day and many, many other times after that. But I think she'd really wanted me to go to a small private liberal arts school, a Colgate or one of those kinds of colleges. And I did consider those, and I applied to some of those and was accepted. But at the end of the day, there was something about those I knew who had been to West Point. And if you really think about why people do what they do in life, it's often they want to be like Mike, if you will. They see Michael Jordan, I want to be like him. You see, Captain Carpenter, and he earns a Distinguished Service Cross on the battlefield in Vietnam, which I remember delivering the newspaper that had his picture on it when he came back from that. And he'd married a local girl and so forth. And those that I knew who had gone to West Point, the graduates, those who were working there, it just seemed to be an awfully special place. And it was, and it is. And I, count myself very lucky to have gone down that course. There's a certain romantic view of some of this as well, a slightly heroic image of whatever. But in fact, my mother also made me one summer read a book called The Royal Road to Romance by Richard Halliburton, which was about a Princeton graduate. One of the reasons I actually went to Princeton for graduate school. And he was quite an adventurer. He was one of those who, when he got out of college, instead of going into the family financial business or whatever, he went on a tramp steamer and went to Europe and did all these different exploits. He swam the Hellespont like Byron. He ran the original marathon, although he got drunk in the final 2 miles. He climbed the Matterhorn by himself. Many of these were quite significant accomplishments in their day. And that kind of feeling is what you have some sense of, I think, when you raise your right hand and take the oath on the plane at West Point, noting that that's pretty quickly dispelled and you get into the normal routine. Groundhog Day sets in pretty quickly. It does in any profession. And perhaps for those, the delegates at an academy event, I used to note on occasion that, even in the loftiest of positions, you can be, again, the commander of the SURS, the commander of CentralCom, the director of the CIA, there is a Groundhog Day syndrome that does set in. It doesn't matter how high you are, you start to get into this, today is going to be just like yesterday, and tomorrow looks like it's going to be as well, maybe different congressional visitors, different press, different activities. In truth, it's not, but you get into that particularly, frankly, in military and combat, because you're going 7 days a week. There's very little time of, your own at all. You read a couple of pages of a book each night before you fall asleep with the light still on. And so it's important, I think. I used to say that when this happens to you, the people with whom I was privileged to serve at the time or whatever, occasionally you want to go on up to 30,000 feet, do a little out-of-body experience, and look down at what you're doing and look down at the endeavor in which you're playing a part and realize how special that is, what a privilege that is to be serving a cause larger than self, a mission that really is important to not just to our country, but to all of the coalition countries, and then get on back down and go to work. I really enjoyed the chemistry class that we had. I guess it was the first semester of second year, or maybe the second semester of first year, but it was early on. And I decided to take some more. And interesting, the roommate that I had most of the time that I was there at West Point was doing pre-med. He did eventually become a doctor, an Army doctor, and served to be a colonel. And I really enjoyed those courses very, very much. But in my senior year, this is a very competitive program. There were 1% of the class was allowed to go to compete to go to medical school. But the fact is, if you got into that 1%, which I think was 9 people in the end, you were guaranteed a slot in the medical school. And because again, we had a very good program, and the Army, took care of everything for it. So again, there was a great deal of interest in it. But I got in the latter part of the first semester of the senior year, and all of a sudden realized I was about number 5 or so out of this, because you start to winnow it down pretty quickly, and you know what everyone else's grades were in those days. They were all posted. And I asked myself if I really had a calling to be a doctor or not, and I actually couldn't answer in the affirmative. So I decided, well, maybe I shouldn't do that, because there's a huge commitment attached to it, and I thought it would be difficult if you actually get into that and say, geez, why did I do this? It was just because it was the highest mountain to climb academically. So sort of had the peak in sight, but then I decided to seek the infantry, and I enjoyed it very much. And again, there was an interesting mix. I always found in the Army, in fact, a very interesting mix between the intellectual and the physical. And the infantry clearly had both of those, but you can be literally out under a rucksack in field conditions 1 year, and you're at graduate school at Princeton University the next, or you're writing speeches for the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO again 1 year, and the next year you're the operations officer for an infantry battalion right on the Iron Curtain. So I loved that mix back and forth and found it very, very stimulating. We all wanted to go to Ranger School if you were an infantry lieutenant, or at least you should. And I set my sights on that and tried to prepare as well as I could. And frankly, I was really in extraordinary physical condition when I was there. And what was grinding to some really was not to me. And it sort of plays to the strengths of a guy who can, run and carry a rucksack and all the rest of this stuff. And so that was a piece of cake, and my Ranger buddy and I, who was a West Point classmate of mine, approached this as a very competitive endeavor, and so we were the first ones through in the land navigation course. This is at night with everything else, and it was, and then you're doing a lot of leadership stuff and leading patrols and helping others with that. It's very, very demanding physically. In those days, you ended up with a final 2-week period in the field in the swamps of Florida. You actually start in Georgia, you then go to the mountains of Georgia, and we did it in January, which is a brutal time to be in Dahlonega, North Georgia. It's quite a bit of altitude, and there's a lot of snow on the ground, and it's almost a physical survival kind of endeavor at certain points in time when it gets if it starts to flirt with 0 degrees, you're out there day after day, and the exposure starts to accumulate for a lot of people. The first time pass rate, I think, probably was below 50%, maybe even 40% in Winter Ranger. We ended up in the swamps, and you go 2 weeks where you have 1 meal a day. And I mean, people lose 35 pounds in those days. With that nonsense, we've stopped. That's just foolish physiologically. But you get so tired that you can fall asleep standing up. And we literally had people that just started to have some form of delusions, and we had to put a sling rope on them, what you use for mountain climbing, which we always carried with us. We'd put a sling rope on and we just pulled them through the swamps. And you're in water up to your thigh or waist a good bit of the time, even when you're not actually in the rivers and doing river crossing or operations like that. So it's very, very challenging. And I was fortunate. I had a couple of breaks, and I ended up number one in the class. And there were 3 awards in those days, and I took all 3 of them, and it was a nice day. Even though my wife didn't recognize me, she thought I looked like somebody out of a refugee camp after having gone through this experience. I did always cherish, frankly, physical fitness activities, various sports, various, frankly, competitions. In fact, we used to have a saying in many of the units which I served. I mean, life is a competitive endeavor, and there's nothing more competitive, obviously, than combat. And I had a captain walk in one time when I was a lieutenant colonel, a battalion commander, and he was this incredibly inspirational company commander. He had a great sense of humor as well, and he walked into the office and he said, "Sir, winners win stuff every now and then." And I said, "That's very profound, Fred. Thank you very much." But he was exactly right. And we tried, we did our best. Now occasionally you have to compete to be the best team player you can be in a collective organization. So you want to compete fairly. You want to compete, when you don't bring home the gold, you've got to, be graceful in defeat as well as in victory. But so there was always a physical piece to that. In fact, I just had a run along the water here in San Francisco, 6 miles. It was awesome, and hit the gym. And there is something about that I think is terrific. But there is the affinity for the intellectual side of it, for the thinking side of it, and for trying to identify, the right big ideas. They may be new big ideas, they may be old big ideas, but it has to be the right strategy. It has to be the right approach. And I did put a fair amount into that. In fact, I used to, when I was a 3-star commander out at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, it was the year that we did the counterinsurgency field manual. We had all the pre-command course students there, and so I would talk to them for 90 minutes each time. It was once a month, and it was all the future battalion and brigade commanders and their command sergeants major as well. And I would ask them how many, had written this command philosophy letter that everybody wrote, and all hands, and how some had done 20 drafts. And I used to say, tear it up. They're meaningless. It was a big blow to them. My God, tear up my command philosophy. It's a 1-page usually. They're all the same. It says mission first, troops always, somewhere in there. Some are more eloquent than others. And I said, instead, focus on what the big 5 areas of focus are going to be for your unit. And don't just identify them. Then figure out what are the actual programs that will operationalize those areas of focus. So if you say, again, physical fitness, which is a pretty good big 5 if you're, say, in an air assault or airborne infantry unit, as I was privileged to command, what does that mean? What are the standards? What's the standard for a 4-mile run, for various other events? How often do you road march? How do you earn excellence? What happens if someone is inadequate, is in a sense deficient? What are the penalties? What are the rewards? What are the incentives? What are the various activities, the components? Oh, by the way, is it more than just sort of physical training? Is it also perhaps health? Smoking cessation is a big one that we used to focus on. No dipping was another one, believe it or not. It was a huge epidemic in infantry units in particular. Use of alcohol and so forth. So what does an area of how do you, again, operationalize this and spend time on that? That takes serious thinking and a huge amount of very, very hard work. It is not easy. I have often said that, big ideas don't hit you on the head like Newton's apple if you sit under the right tree. You have to really work at them. You get hit by a little seed of a big idea, and then you have to, like someone with clay, and you involve as many people in it as you can. It's an inclusive process. You shape it, you try it, you throw it to the wall and see if it sticks, all of these types of techniques. But that's how you ultimately arrive at, again, good big ideas. And I'll talk more about that in the concept of strategic leadership. Actually, what he was trying to do was to develop his big ideas. For he was going to be the division commander of the 24th Infantry Division at Fort Stewart, Georgia, where I'd been assigned for 2.5 years. I'd commanded a company, and then I was a battalion operations officer, which is actually normally a major position for a major, and my battalion commander wanted me to do it as a captain with just about 1.5 years time in grade. In any event, so they were looking for an aide for the new division commander, and the one-star said that, here's a nominee for you. And so he picked me, and so he arrives, and he said, I'm sort of thinking through, do you have any thoughts on what I might do here? And, as only a young, I guess, idealistic captain can do, and, very serious and earnest, I put a lot of work into this. I wrote a big memo that talked about big personnel changes in certain areas, some very significant different ways of doing business, if you will, than his predecessor had. And I remember he called me into the office, and he said, are there any more copies of this? And I said, no, sir, this is back in the days of typewriters. And he said, good. He said, this is very, very good, but I don't want it going out anywhere. Ultimately, he actually took about every action that was in this. And again, some of these were very significant changes in personnel. And I'm not saying, some of those were self-evident, I would assume, as well to him. But what it began was a relationship that was really quite extraordinary. I spent that year as his aide, and it was a wonderful experience. He was very much a soldier scholar and ultimately statesman as well, in his 4-star assignments as the Commander-in-Chief of U.S. Southern Command, all of Latin America, and then the NATO Supreme Allied Commander in Europe. And I worked for him again as a temporary duty special assistant in Panama, where the headquarters was for Southern Command, traveled with him all that summer. And then when he was named the next Supreme Allied Commander, he requested that I be released from West Point a year early, where I was teaching, and go over there and spend this first year with him as a speechwriter. And the truth is, we had a correspondence that continued forever. I might add, I am literally right now finalizing the foreword for a book that is, this will be his memoirs, Memoirs of a Cold Warrior. And it reminded me, as we've been doing it together to a degree, and it just reminded me of what a joy it was to work for him, to, in a sense, write with him. It was the way he was a speechwriter as well. Earlier in his life, he was an English professor. He had written 3 books. He was really quite an extraordinary individual. He was highly decorated on the battlefield in Vietnam, but was also known for very forthright, calm, forthright responses to senior officers, one of which got him fired, and he still survived. It was a case where a very senior commander came in after a battle. He was a major, and the senior commander said, I see all these, it looks like about this number of bodies. And the major said, sir, actually, it's not that many. And he stuck to that, and he was reassigned. And, God bless him. He was a very low ego, but there were moments where he could be very, very determined in a very forthright way. And I saw this during the year when he was a Supreme Allied Commander in particular. And it was quite an experience to be, to a degree, at his right hand. I might add, when I took that job, I said there were conditions for me to take. Again, only a major could dream up conditions for working for the Supreme Allied Commander. But I told his executive officer, Brigadier General, I said, I have to hear the speech if I write it. So I have to travel with him. I have to be in the car with him on the way to the speech. I know him personally. I know what it takes to get him fired up if it's been a really long day. I know how to get him focused, get him in the zone, and all the rest of this stuff. And I don't want someone else in there, and then he arrives in the wrong sort of frame of mind and not in that zone. And then I said, we have to get some computers and automation. The NATO headquarters was way behind the times at that moment, and that was an easy one. But it was a great experience, and it continued for years and years. And in a day when people sent, correspondence back and forth, we'd send 2- and 3-page single-spaced letters to each other every couple of weeks, really. He was a great correspondent. He was a fabulous mentor. He was very generous with his time. He was wonderfully considerate of others. He had a wry sense of humor, and he could see things in other people, and then we'd compare notes afterwards. And we'd be bumping along the trail in Fort Stewart, Georgia, there going on an exercise and quoting Kipling's Tommy to each other. General Galvin was a huge influence. He was, I think, the most wonderful mentor anybody could have, and certainly the most wonderful I had. And I had a lot of great ones over the years. I think about General Vano and General Keane and General Shelton, General McNeil, all these. And then some, in a sense, below me, if you will, that were a command sergeant major or a first sergeant, or I was very privileged to serve with some extraordinary individuals. Again, some above me, some peers, some subordinates in the chain of command. But you learn, I think, in a 360-degree way, not just from those above you. This course that I teach now at the Honors College of the City University of New York, after 2 semesters, the students have all agreed that what they got out of it, most of all, the most important skill or knowledge they got was writing and briefing, of all things. And in fact, here there will be a delegate who, I think the only student or one of 2 who got an A+ in that course. And they actually bring him back to teach the other students in the first session of each semester how to write a policy paper and how to give a PowerPoint briefing, of all things. And we work that quite hard. And in fact, some of the students get to do it more than once because they're honor students. I don't want them to have a grade that would be less than what we would expect of honor students, so they occasionally get a second or even a third chance. Although at a certain point, obviously, you have to call them like they are. The dissertation was titled The American Military and the Lessons of Vietnam. And it looked at how Vietnam influenced the senior military leadership in giving advice to the President, Secretary of Defense, other civilian leaders on the use of force, both whether you should or should not, and if so, how it should be applied. And it was a very, very useful exercise in a whole host of different ways. One, it, again, taught me more about how to communicate, how to write. I was very privileged to have as my senior dissertation advisor, an individual had been editorial page of the New York Times. He was a Harvard Rhodes Scholar, Oxford PhD under George Kennan. He was the head of studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. He was the editor of Foreign Policy magazine at the time that I was working with him at Princeton. Richard Ullman, Dick Ullman, and just an extraordinary individual. In fact, one who gave a tremendous amount of himself. We just had the memorial ceremony for him recently, and it was astonishing the number of people who were there overall. And then second, what many of those people had achieved: national security advisors, trade representatives, generals, titans of the financial industry, you name it. And all of us felt an enormous debt of gratitude to him for the time he gave to us. And it's something that we then tried to do for others, obviously, as well. But as I went through my career, I specifically chose a topic that I thought would help me develop intellectual capital that I might use later on in my career. So I didn't want to do something about, the Peloponnesian Wars or the Revolutionary War or something. I wanted it to be a bit more current and to get at the most important issue that senior military leaders ever confront in their careers, if they confront it at all, and that is the issue of military advice on the use of force. And so there I was years later, working for the Supreme Allied Commander, working for the Chief of Staff of the Army, and ultimately as the executive officer for the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff when we were doing Bosnia, Kosovo, strikes against Saddam Hussein, strikes on Osama bin Laden, and all the rest, and could bring back up the lessons that I'd learned in looking at the lessons of Vietnam that military leaders took. And what was the character of their advice, and what was it that, again, led to that advice? What were the factors on which they drew? And when it came time when I was the one actually offering a recommendation and options to two different presidents in two different wars, I found that a very, very useful study, because what I took from that was that the job of a military commander in combat, in the field in particular, is to provide the president his best professional military advice based on his understanding of the mission that he's developed with the president in that context, in those conditions, in that battlefield, informed by an awareness of the issues with which the president has to deal that the commander doesn't have to deal with directly. So, you have to acknowledge there are national politics, congressional politics, coalition politics, fiscal deficit, strain on the force, programs, you name it. But at the end of the day, that advice is it's driven by the facts on the ground. And there was a moment where I reminded each president of this at some key moments. And in one moment, I did not change my recommendation after several meetings, to the surprise of some of those in the room who were all changing, or at least agreeing to a new forthcoming decision. It didn't mean that I didn't support the decision fully, publicly, and so forth, but it did mean that my recommendation was unchanged, and that was, at least to me, an issue of integrity. So again, there were a lot of lessons out of Vietnam, and again, as I mentioned, I tried to draw on those, and particularly with this very, very important issue about when it really comes down to it, and you're sitting at the Situation Room in the West Wing, and the eyes go to you, and you are the commander of that particular theater. That's a fairly big moment. And it helps if you've thought through, if you have an intellectual construct for what your responsibilities are. Because I've seen others do differently. I mean, I had one time someone above me who, rather than focusing on the military advice and commenting on what I had recommended right before him, said, well, I'm not sure Congress will buy this or something like that. The president's response was, let me worry about Congress. What do you think of the military aspects of this? And that was exactly right. The first really 6 months or so of the surge were very, very, very hard. I said before we started it, and repeated this on a number of occasions in those early months, that it was going to get harder before it got easier. That when we moved into these neighborhoods, we'd have to fight our way in. That we would have to take areas away from the Sunni insurgents, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, or Shia militia, all of whom were fighting over it. And yet that was the only way that we could drive down the level of violence and get to a position where you can restore basic services and regain the trust of the people and help them reestablish markets and rebuild roads, schools, clinics, and then help them reestablish local governance and the rule of law and all the other aspects of society that we take for granted, but which all cease functioning when you're in the middle of a war zone. So those early days were very, very early months were very hard. Our casualties went way up. We had some of the worst months on record during those. In fact, all the way June of 2000, 7 was a very difficult month in that regard. But right after that, then all of a sudden the level of violence started to go down very rapidly. And for 8 of the 11 weeks prior to the hearing in September that was so important, that was staring at us out there, we saw significant declines in the numbers of attacks, the numbers of our casualties, number of civilian casualties, number of Iraqi military casualties. But I remember I was reading about Grant during this time, and it was a book. Somebody shoved it into a rucksack on the way, gave it to me right before I left, and ended up on a night table. And there was this episode of Grant at Shiloh where Grant had a very, very bad first day at Shiloh. His army was almost driven into the river, in fact. And he's sitting that night. There's no cover available anywhere because every available house or shanty, anything, is filled with surgeons operating on wounded Union soldiers. You have the cries of the wounded out on the battlefield that they were unable to evacuate. It's raining, the screams of those whose limbs are being removed with a saw and that kind of thing are just horrific. And he's sitting by himself under a tree. He got a stub of a cigar in his mouth. He had his big Union hat on with the rain dripping off it. And out of the darkness comes Sherman, his favorite general, his best lieutenant, if you will. And Sherman sees that Grant is thinking, so he takes a moment. And then he finally says, "Well, Grant, we had the devil's own day today, didn't we?" And Grant says, "Yep, lick 'em tomorrow, though." And I recounted that at a particularly difficult time. It was a day where we took terrible casualties. A house had been blown up with our soldiers in it by the overpressure from a suicide bomber. They actually weren't even able to penetrate, but the construction was not sufficient. And we'd taken a lot of other tough casualties. There'd been a couple of car bombs in Baghdad. The Iraqis had taken terrible losses. And I remember telling that and saying, lick 'em tomorrow. And we had a lot of lick 'em tomorrow moments before the levels of violence started going down. And even after that, it was never. And the fact is that command in a place like that, that is a lonely endeavor because there's no other 4-star in theater. You have no peers. Everybody there is working for you. I guess you have the ambassador, but he's over at the embassy. I was over there every day because we had offices that adjoined, used the same waiting room, in fact, so that we could really have integrated activities. And we had a civil-military campaign plan, not just a military. In fact, I used to get questions, why do we have all this civilian stuff in the campaign plan? I said, well, sir, it's because it's a civilian military campaign plan. This is how we achieve unity of effort, which is so important in a comprehensive civil-military counterinsurgency campaign. I think all of us just try to study as much as we can and take what we can from the experiences of others. I'd read a great deal, actually, about the experiences, obviously, of the U.S. in Vietnam, of the French in Vietnam and in Indochine, Indochina, as they called it, also in Algeria, the British in Oman and Malaya, a variety of other different places that were, in a sense, irregular warfare. I saw it for myself in El Salvador, where there was a real civil-military national plan that did achieve impressive results. Studied the British in Northern Ireland, where they made a number of mistakes early on, but gradually were able, over decades, though, again, that's how long some of these take. And again, I didn't have a monopoly on this by any means. There were other commanders that had done this in isolated, not isolated, but areas, but we'd not done it across the board. And in fact, some of the practices that we were doing, again, consolidating on big bases, not sufficiently pursuing reconciliation, releasing detainees, even though the place is almost being run by extremists, if you will, in the words of some. So again, you also then have to have the force of will, because what you want to do is, through your communication, obviously you want everyone to buy in. But the truth is that some of this took persuasion, and reconciliation in particular was a bit of a tough sell early on. I had commanders come to me and said, hey, sir, you want me to sit down across the table from this sheikh of the tribe that's been fighting us, I mean, he has our blood on his hands, and you want me to sit down and negotiate with him? And I said, yeah, that's how these things end. And I said, by the way, I think we can do it. And I think he has an incentive in supporting the new Iraq if we can get him to see that, rather than continuing to fight and also having al-Qaeda blowing him up for his troubles as well. And so that's what we did. But there were again, a lot of tough moments, and you have what we would occasionally call full range of emotion meetings. There were some by design. I would tell people on the way to a particular meeting with a particularly senior Iraqi figure or other senior figures inside Iraq that, buckle your seatbelts, because this is going to be a rugged one, fellas. And what I need you to do is just let it go unless you think I'm no longer acting. And if you really think I'm truly getting emotional about this, then you need to pluck my sleeve, because that's where you occasionally can do something that is, as we say, non-biodegradable. That was, again, quite an emotionally charged situation. And we also had lots of demonstrators, and we had the Pink Ladies and Move On. And MoveOn.org took out a full-page ad attacking me personally.
General Petraeus.
Yeah, in the New York Times. Now, interestingly, that same day arrived in my email a note from someone in my hometown, little village, and reminded me of that poem, If, by Rudyard Kipling. And I have framed that, actually. It hangs on the wall. And if you go back and look at that, of course, that was exactly the kind of sentiment to have when, everyone is focused on having their way with you, if you will. It was particularly interesting because some of the chairmen of the committees their wives had actually come in to meet me before the actual hearings, and they wanted pictures taken and everything else. So all very jovial. I'd known these people for years. But the minute we went out into the hearing room, it was as if, ice came over their face, and there they were, staring down at us, again, hammering away. These were two very long and very interesting days. And, but, we had the facts on our side. I mean, we hadn't manufactured these metrics. I mean, we showed the charts. It was pretty hard to refute. Now, I would be the first to say that it was not yet at a point where I could at all say this is self-sustaining or this is irreversible or anything like that. I said that, we have made significant progress, but it remains fragile. And that's what I really felt. The truth was that early on, I think some of them realized that the smart move was to not allow us to answer a question. So you just issue statements, make stipulations, and then, I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, my time has run out. Can you take those questions for the record, please? Because when they allowed Ambassador Crocker or me to answer a question, I mean, we knew something about Iraq, and we had been implementing a strategy that by then, at least for the previous 3 months, had started to show demonstrable progress, but that had not yet been registered. In fact, complicating the picture was a GAO analysis, I think it was, that had been cut off 2 months prior. And so they were asking, well, why is the GAO, why is the intelligence community report not reflect this? And I said, well, it's actually very simple. They cut it off 2 months before because they had to then wrangle over, the language and get the community buy-in and all the rest of this. I actually broke formally, in fact, with the intelligence community, which of course I later led a major agency of, on that particular report. But it was very straightforward. I said, Mr. President, I'm breaking with this formally because I'm giving you an assessment based on the situation today. They cut it off 2 months ago so that they could argue out what the community position was and get the editing right and package it and everything else. Something we tried to cut down, by the way, I might add, when I was the director of the CIA. I subsequently broke with the community 3 more times. I think that's an all-time record for formal. And, to imagine a commander of the combat zone is breaking with the intelligence community is a fairly big deal. Interestingly, it was only twice that I felt that they were not sufficiently positive. So it wasn't that I always had a more rosy picture. Twice I actually said they were too positive. that we hadn't. In fact, the next one in Iraq, the following spring, I said, this is too rosy. It's not this rosy. And in fact, lo and behold, we had the battles with the militia and so forth that proved that to be true. So it was these were very, very interesting moments. They were very highly charged, though. And again, if you ever go back and look at the pictures of the video of the sheer number of cameras, I think there might have been 100 cameramen crowding all into the well around Ambassador Crocker and me. That goes with the territory. Welcome to the National Football League. It's a contact sport. And what you had to do was just stay even and calm and, not let the blood boiling get out. Because some of these were, when you have your integrity challenged somewhat openly like that, and so again, which number don't you like? Do you have better data? But again, you obviously you hold your fire, as they say. You bite your tongue and you just move through it and try to obviously be as calm and professional as you possibly can. We used to say, I want brutally honest assessments. I want the facts, just the facts, ma'am. And you have to push that hard because people get pretty attached to the results in their area, and they think, rightly so, in some degree, that it reflects their performance. The problem is that sometimes bad things happen to great units. Sometimes we give great units missions that aren't feasible in accomplishment based on the sheer numbers that they have or the resources we give them. And you have to, but this is again comes back to also being forthright with those above you. And I tried to do that with the press as well. I felt that there was an obligation of commanders in the field to tell the American public, tell the coalition public, because of course we had, 35 or so countries. I think when we started in Iraq with the surge, we had 50 at the height of the coalition in Afghanistan when I was the commander. We owed that to them. They had and I also felt they had a right to get to know the commander who was leading their sons and daughters. And occasionally, I was accused of being too high profile, and there were some moments that I'd sure like to have back in that regard. The Newsweek cover that said, "Can this man save Iraq?" when I was a brand new 3-star general was a little bit much, I think, for a lot of people to swallow, and it was. So you just, again, you learn constantly. You're constantly trying to re-examine how can you get better. But that does start with, you have to have analysis of not just yourself, but the enterprise you're leading. Again, the results of your scientific experiments, the results of your operations. But if you can get the big ideas right, I think you have a pretty sporting chance of seeing the results of the operation, the experiment, be positive. But not always. And again, the challenge is dealing with adversity, especially when adversity is a daily, sometimes an hourly experience. I used to say that commanders, in particular leaders, because it's not just commissioned officers, it's non-commissioned officers, but leaders are like a vessel, if you will, and it has holes in the bottom, and you pour bad news in the top. And the worst of all bad news is obviously losses or very serious injuries, wounds. And if you get too much of that, it can actually boil over. And I spent quite a bit of time over those years in Iraq and then in Afghanistan as well, where I'd go out on occasion, probably every other week or so, we'd have one of these, certainly once a month. And I would ultimately sit down with the commander and sort of stare into his eyes to see if he had reached the point where this was starting to overflow, because we had some units that took very, very tough losses and very tough casualties. There was a unit in Baghdad, for example, that I decided needed to be moved from the location in which it was positioned because it just couldn't take any more of that level of combat. And so what we did, and I've never been one who believes in public executions, if you will, public firings or, I've always thought that, you ought to try to allow a person to have as much dignity and respect as possible, even if, frankly, you're replacing the individual or clearly have recognized that this individual should not progress further. But there's no reason, I don't think, again, to be harsh in that kind of activity. And There's no reason you can't try to make the individual, at least allow him to retain as much, again, of his own dignity and self-respect as well as is possible. And so we did in that case, we did a battlefield geometry re-examination, and we decided we'd shift some units around, and it was part of a big shift, and as opposed to saying this unit can't take it anymore. You've got to, try to keep your ego in check. It can lead you down the wrong path at times. So again, you are constantly looking, and of course, if you get sufficiently senior, folks tend to say, yes, sir, not, excuse me, have you really thought about this? And so you also actually have to try to foster a command climate, a culture, if you will, in your unit, collective unit, that is one that welcomes people being forthright. And you're not committing professional suicide if you raise your hand and challenge the boss. It's okay to say, Emperor, you're scantily clothed today intellectually. And that's very, very important to do. Galvin did this amazingly well. Galvin used to have me do a monthly performance evaluation of him. I'm a young captain, mid-rank captain. He's a 2-star general with extraordinary accomplishment already. And he said, every month I want you to give me an efficiency report, an evaluation. And again, as only a young captain can, you took it seriously. And I would grade every one of his speeches. I flunked him one time. We had a huge fight over this. I said, sir, you didn't want to be there. You communicated that effectively to your audience, and it was deficient. Oh my God. But we always, you could work this out. And again, you don't normally, you do this in an affirmative way. In fact, I'm a believer in affirmative leadership. In other words, as opposed to saying, hey, you better get that report in on Monday, close of business, or I'll have your backside. Instead, you say, hey, I look forward to confirming your excellence on Monday. I know this is going to be a great report, and I'm really looking forward to seeing that on my desk and to going through it. It's going to be terrific. Now, you've made the same point. Get the report on my desk on Monday without fail. But again, the kind of affirmative rather than negative leadership, I think, is very important. In fact, if I could, for a moment, people constantly ask folks who have risen to a certain level about their leadership style. And so they say, General, Director, can you describe to me your leadership style? And they presumably want to hear, I'm hard but fair, or I'm a really good guy, or I'm whatever it may be. And I'd say, actually, I'll tell you what my leadership style is for each of my direct reports and for the organization collectively. If you'll tell me what style of leadership is required for each of those direct reports and the organization collectively to help each be all that he or she or it can be. Because the truth is, every organization's different, every person's different. I might need guidance twice a day. Someone else might need guidance twice a year. I need pats on the back every half hour. Others don't need anything. And then some either may need a, application of a foot somewhere. But you have to understand each individual, and your style with each individual is slightly, it's differentiated. And the leadership style that works, I think, what I tried to do at the CIA, for example, is a very different leadership style than what works as a romp and stomp and infantry platoon leader, where it's literally follow me, and again, a fairly visceral experience. The agency is a combination of very highly developed analytical folks and superb operators. And again, you have to be all things to all people if you're going to lead effectively, I think. You got to get out of bed every day. You got to, as Bill McRaven says, success starts by making your bed in the morning. Everything after that, So actually for me, it was, dragging yourself out and getting that workout in, even because especially in combat, so I'd get up at 5 or so and, get a cup of coffee and go through overnight stuff that had come in. And reports and so forth from the battlefield, intel and everything else, and then hop on a stationary bike that was actually in our complex usually, and pedal away for 45 or 60 minutes. If it wasn't a run day, we tried to run a few days a week in both Iraq and Afghanistan, but it's tough. The problem in a combat situation in particular is, again, because it's 7 days a week, and it's really is sort of 24 hours a day. It's at least 18 hours a day. You're on the edge of what you can physically handle. You're right at it, and you're trying not to go over the edge, because if you go over the edge, you start falling asleep in meetings where people are briefing you, and that's not a good place to be. You're also not as coherent as you ought to be. I reached points during the fight to Baghdad where I couldn't stay awake unless I stood up. And I mean, you're the commander of the division. This is a foolish position to find yourself. And in fact, God bless the command sergeant major. He sort of put his arm around his shoulder and he said, "Sir, you're not very good to any of us right now. Why don't you let the 1-star take this for a while, and you go down, and I'll wake you up in 5 hours or something like that, or 4 hours." But you're right at the edge of what you can handle physically. And if you get a long phone call at night, or you get something and then you don't go back to bed, or you're turning it over, you're right at the edge of that. And so for one thing, physical fitness helps you a great deal. But boy, it's tough sometimes to contemplate that when the alarm clock goes off. We have a challenge on which we're just embarking, of course, in Iraq and in Syria. The president, I felt, made a very compelling case for the threat that the Islamic State poses to the region, to our allies, and ultimately to us. And I think he had a very convincing argument for the need to take action to combat that threat. And then he provided a good point of departure for the strategy that we will now follow. But this is going to be a different approach. I think it's an approach that can achieve its goals in Iraq, actually. I think we may be underestimating the capabilities of the Iraqi forces based on the reverses, the collapses that we saw in the north, where they didn't have good planning, competent leadership, and they didn't have the enablers that we can provide: close air support, intelligence support, and so forth. And then, frankly, it's going to be very challenging in Syria. This is going to be hugely difficult, and that's where we're going to need the next big ideas. You look at all the economies of the world, you then gradually focus in on North America. All the others are either slowing down, treading water, experiencing reverses. This has been what we call an asynchronous recovery for the world, and the United States is recovering at this point in time. I think it's established now, and I think it's gaining momentum. And this is a result of the kind of spirit of innovativeness, inquiry, our system, if you will, that has led to the energy revolution, the IT revolution, which enabled all the others, the manufacturing revolution, and now the beginning life sciences revolution. Our country is quite extraordinary. We face a lot of headwinds. We need those in Washington, the elected officials, to help us deal with the debt to GDP ratio, with the education reform, comprehensive immigration reform, infrastructure investment, a whole host of topics that need to be addressed that could turn into tailwinds to our economy rather than impeding the progress that is going to be made because of these revolutions and because of the system and so forth. But we need that help there, and perhaps some of the delegates can, at some point, assume some of those positions and help us do that.